The following discussion was held on Sunday, July 20th, between Kailāsa Candra dāsa and two other members in good standing of the Vaishnava Foundation, namely Gokulānanda and Sanātana.
Hare Om Namaha. This month we finish our analysis of Henry Doktorski's most important work entitled 11 Naked Emperors. It is the last chapter of that book which we analyze, review, and critique, although it is not the final chapter in that work. This was mentioned at the very beginning of the series analysis which began last year. We are thus reviewing the penultimate chapter of the book, namely chapter 15, which goes by the title, The Rittvik Question. We shall refer to Rittvik movements, which are highly centrifugal, nevertheless, as if we're going to refer to them as if they're one. We shall refer to it either as Rittvik or the post-samādhi Rittvik-in-absentia concoction. Chapter 15's review by Doktorski is neither completely favorable nor completely unfavorable to the Rittvik proposal, which, most unfortunately, is believed in and followed by thousands of devotees at this time. However, please note, we are completely unfavorable to Rittvik, which you will clearly glean as this review proceeds. We find the following passage from chapter 15 in its initial pages, quote, "Today, a growing number of Gaudiya Vaishnavas say that Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada wanted to continue the ISKCON disciplic succession not by successor Diksha gurus, but by Rittvik deputies, and they claim to have evidence to support their position." Unquote. Gokulānanda, particularly as it concerns evidence, the wrong idea that Rittvik is what Prabhupada wanted. What do you think about this passage?
I have found no solid or strong evidence that Rittvik is bona fide. I have also done my research on this topic, and I see no strong evidence that Prabhupada wanted the Rittvik method of initiation to continue after he left physical manifestation. I do not believe that these Rittvik deputies of today have any śāstric or real evidence to back their concoction.
Do you agree with Gokulānanda on this, Sanātana?
Yes, I do agree that Rittvik is a concoction. After all, it has no basis in Vaishnava paramparā whatsoever. You need a perfect master, a physical spiritual master, in order to be genuinely initiated into the line of disciplic succession. And we know from Prabhupada that the guru must be a very perfect man, and he must be physically manifest on earth when he accepts a disciple and initiates him into his branch of the guru paramparā. Rittvik, however, destroys this truth and the system, and therefore it is an anti-Vedic, anti-Vaishnava concoction.
We find the following quote from chapter 15. "Those who have progressed to the stage of anarta nivritti may initiate others on behalf of the Satguru, namely Śrīla Prabhupāda, with the clear understanding, both on their part and the part of the initiates, that Śrīla Prabhupāda is the actual preceptor and will continue to be so after the time of initiation, and with the clear understanding that they are factually older, more experienced disciples, helping the inexperienced disciples of the common spiritual master." Karnamrita's July 1986 article was one of the first calls to adopt what later became known as the posthumous Rittvik system, or the Rittvik-in-absentia theory. Was this the seed of what became Rittvik in late 1989?
Actually, it was already a developing seed because one of the 11 pretenders, Rameshvara, had previously mentioned a similar idea when he briefly, rejected Uttama worship at Los Angeles at the beginning of the 80s. However, Karnamrita was a major proponent of the Rittvik concoction, being one of the 4 Brahmins pushing it from Mississippi in 1989. This particular excerpt, which you just read of his, was from an article in the short-lived Vaishnava Journal of the mid-80s, which the air quotes ISKCON leaders soon shut down. By the time of the Mississippi proposal, when it was published in their Vedic Village Review, the Rittvik seed was starting to sprout.
In a nutshell, what was that original proposal?
It was that there should be no worship of air quotes ISKCON gurus, and they should not be recognized as having advanced to the stage where they could be adored as exalted Vaishnavas on the highest level. They should simply continue as Ritviks, which they were previous to Prabhupada's having left the scene in November of 1977. The first Rittvik proposal was that the remaining gurus in good standing should admit their statuses and convert back to Ritviks. All previous initiations, beginning from December 1977, were to be considered Rittvik initiations. The proposal included the idea that only the GBC could appoint any future Ritviks to carry on initiations on behalf of Prabhupada, who would then be recognized as the Diksha Guru of the movement.
We find the following passage in chapter 15. Many disciples who suffered under the oppression of the ISKCON zonal acharya system perceived continuing the disciplic succession by Rittvik representatives instead of by unqualified pretender Diksha gurus as an improvement. Certainly, establishing a system of Rittvik representation after the passing of the acharya was unprecedented in the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, but Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, they reasoned, was no ordinary spiritual master. If he wanted to authorize and establish such a novel means of continuing the disciplic succession, he had the power from Krishna, they say, to do so. There seems to be a hint of weakness embedded in this initial Rittvik proposal by the Brahmins of Mississippi. Is this so? And if it is so, are there any other weaknesses in their proposal?
Affirmative on both counts. The Rittvik idea remains unprecedented in the history of not only Vaishnavism, but all Vedic lines of teachings, all disciplic successions from time immemorial. Besides this, there are 2 other major weaknesses in that initial Rittvik idea promulgated in late 1989. Sanātana, can you figure out at least one of those?
Is it lack of verification from Prabhupada?
That is another one. Nowhere do we find, in any of Prabhupada's purports, platform lectures, room conversations, morning walks, letters, or official documents, that he establishes this post-samādhi Rittvik-in-absentia proposal. The actual system of Vedic and Vaishnava initiation requires a physical master, quote. Therefore, God is called Chaitya Guru, the spiritual master within the heart, and the physical spiritual master is God's mercy. If God sees that you are sincere, he will give you a spiritual master who can give you protection. He will help you from within and without. Without, in the physical form of a spiritual master, and within, as the spiritual master within the heart, unquote. Because Prabhupada had thousands of disciples internationally, he utilized a form of the Vedic Rittvik process which is authorized when properly applied. He was physically present somewhere during these initiation ceremonies, which were conducted by Ritviks on his behalf. The Yajamana, the disciple, was initiated by Prabhupada, and the Ritviks conducted the ceremony. He was physically present somewhere on earth in order to take the sanchita karma of the Yajamana, and that is required. He was also present so that the disciple could contact him on the physical plane or write letters to him or be present when he gave a platform lecture, etc. It was not at all infrequent that he was also physically present at an initiation ceremony, but chose not to conduct it himself while his Ritviks did so on his behalf in his physical presence.
What is the third flaw in the initial Rittvik proposal made by the 4 Brahmins in Mississippi?
Their proposal relied upon GBC approval, which it never attained. The GBC rejected post-samādhi Rittvik-in-absentia in the spring of 1990 during its Mayapur conclave. As such, the proposal lost all viability because it tried to make Ritviks special by way of having them appointed by the vitiated GBC before they could function. They tried to link their proposal to the original Rittvik system, which acted in a bona fide way from 1970 until late 1977. Prabhupada appointed all of the Ritviks during that time frame, giving them his stamp of approval. In his physical absence, the initial Rittvik proposal replaced him with the GBC. But the GBC did not acquiesce to this suggestion. Instead, the Commish condemned it and would also officially call it a dangerous deviation in 1990.
What about this argument, which was already mentioned in the excerpt from chapter 15, namely that Prabhupada was no ordinary spiritual master, so therefore he could create a post-samādhi Rittvik-in-absentia system?
There are 2 essential points to be made here. First, he did not so choose. This has already been mentioned. Where is the solid evidence that he wanted this system? There is none. It is all based upon inference and imagination. It is based upon weak evidence, far removed from proof of concept. It is based upon wishful thinking. It is based upon the belief that even if there are no bona fide gurus, initiations must somehow or other go on despite that gaping flaw. Secondly, and just as importantly, this fanciful idea that Prabhupada was so special that he could contradict tradition and śāstra at will is preposterous. He had no such authority to do that, and he did not do that. The Guru, even when he is an uttama adhikari on the highest level of power, love, and realization, is still limited by the boundaries of established Vaishnava tradition, śāstra, and the established order. The established order of a physically manifest spiritual master initiating his disciple to a connection with the Vaishnava Guru paramparā is beyond reproach. Everyone in India accepts it as intrinsic to Vedic and Vaishnava teachings. It is one of the key components that differentiates the Vedic and Vaishnava system of connection to the Supreme Absolute Truth, the personality of Godhead, from all the priestcraft of the West.
What is the history of Rittvik? Can you give a concise overview of it? Did Doktorski do so in chapter 15? Is Rittvik growing and spreading? Could it possibly fulfill in due course of time the prophecy of the Hare Krishna mantra spreading to every town and village of the world?
The history of Rittvik is checkered and sporadic. It proceeded in stops and starts. The idea of a Madhyam Udhikari actually being a Rittvik and initiating on Prabhupada's behalf, a completely bogus understanding of the actual process, was vaguely and indirectly brought into the movement when Rameshwar rejected his alleged status as an Uttama Adhikari in 1980. He defaulted to being a Madhyam, which neither he or his other 10 cohorts, all great pretenders, actually were. At any rate, then the idea disappeared until the 4 Brahmins of Mississippi emerged, with the 4th being Gauridas Pandit from Washington State, who traveled there. he carried the message of Rittvik, claiming to have overheard Prabhupada, Krishna Balaram, and Raman Reti having mentioned it to continue after his disappearance. In issue 11 of the Vedic Village Review, the whole tenor of what the three Brahmins, previous to Gauridas, were preaching radically changed. The leader of the group, Nityananda, fully bought into Rittvik. In effect, Gauridas was the Karl Marx to Nityananda's Lenin. Gauridas had no power to formulate and form anything, but Nityananda, who single-handedly had opened the ISKCON Center in New Orleans back in the 60s, did have that power. As such, Rittvik emerged. Gauridas had only his personal testimony as evidence, but he was merely a servant of TKG, who actually had direct talks with Prabhupada about the future of the movement. Gauridas said he overheard something, so he needed backing, and that was supplied by Yashodanandan at Krishna Balaram in those last months before Prabhupada departed. Yashoda joined the four men of the antebellum shortly after their metamorphosis. He claimed that TKG told him that Rittvik initiations were to continue after Prabhupada departed physical manifestation. However, TKG denied he ever said any such thing to Yashodanandan. It is highly likely that what was jotted down as a note was the result of a miscommunication between those two sannyasis. All of this history is covered in meticulous fashion by Doktorski, so I need not repeat all of those details. Anyone can read the chapter for himself and herself. The Rittvik proposal was part of a challenge horse issued by Nityananda to so-called ISKCON. This led to an ineffectual and little-known, quote-unquote, debate in January of 1990 in Los Angeles. A resolution of some kind of investigation into the controversy at the upcoming Mayapur conclave was procured, but that produced nothing of substance. Rittvik then had to shift its emphasis. Being a centrifugal chameleon, it was intrinsically suited to change itself. Now, the need was seen not to depend upon so-called ISKCON and the vitiated GBC, but to reform it. Thus, the ISKCON reform movement, IRM, emerged from the ocean of nescience. About a decade later, another group called Prominent Link came into being. It advocated the anti-śāstric idea that later initiations by so-called ISKCON were conducted by two Diksha gurus, with the real initiation secured from a non-manifest Diksha guru, Prabhupada, as the prominent link.
Can a newcomer to Krishna consciousness have two Diksha gurus?
No, that is always forbidden. He can have more than one Shiksha guru, but never more than one Diksha guru.
Did Prominent Link have much influence? Did it endure?
It was a short-lived phenomenon. It was a splinter group of Rittvik, but there were other ideas floated. For example, one Rittvik proposal was for initiations in established ISKCON temples to be of the Rittvik variety, and initiations outside of those temples would have the gurus conducting them being the actual Diksha gurus. There was also the question of guidance and orders. When Ritviks initiated newcomers, were those new fellows then as good as the Rittvik, since they were now directly initiated by Prabhupada, allegedly, by the Rittvik conducting the ceremony? Or should they automatically accept that Rittvik as their authority and a Shiksha guru, and thus be obliged to follow his orders, considering him as the representative of Prabhupada? There was also the issue of duration. If an Uttamadhikari emerged, was Rittvik to be immediately shut down? Or was there no possibility of this? Was Prabhupada to be the only Diksha guru for the remainder of Lord Chaitanya's golden age for another 9,500 years? Actually, one fanatic Rittvik who had previously been a second echelon man in so-called ISKCON, directly opined that Prabhupada would be the only acharya in the true sense of the term, and the only initiating spiritual master for his branch of the Gaudiya Sampradaya for the next 8 billion years.
Do the Ritviks accept that since December of 1977, when Kirtanananda first started to initiate new people, that all so-called ISKCON yajamanas in the ceremonies are actually initiated?
All evidence points otherwise, at least on the whole. Some Ritviks believe that they're improperly initiated, but retroactively they can be considered initiated if they adopt Rittvik. However, if one of those unfortunates abandoned so-called ISKCON and approached a Rittvik center, in most, if not all cases, he would be required to undergo a formal Rittvik initiation ceremony at that place. Thus, he would be bamboozled into believing that Prabhupada was now his Diksha Guru. Similarly, so-called ISKCON does not believe that any newcomer partaking as the yajamana in a ceremony conducted by a Rittvik, post-1977 of course, is anything but an improperly initiated person. His initiation would not be accepted by anyone in the air quotes ISKCON movement. If he was a Brahmin in the eyes of the Rittvik movement, so-called ISKCON would not allow him up on the altar. If he abandoned belief in Rittvik and came to so-called ISKCON, he would be urged, strongly urged, to accept initiation from one of its rent acharyas.
Didn't some so-called ISKCON leaders float the idea that so-called ISKCON should offer latitude for Ritviks, thus allowing them to become directly affiliated with so-called ISKCON?
Affirmative. Some years ago, one of the first echelon, air quotes, ISKCON sannyasis made that proposal. He was not alone. He likened it to how Christianity expands its congregation when the so-called high churches, such as the Catholics, Anglicans, and Episcopalians, accept the so-called low churches as also being Christian. The idea did not gain much traction in so-called ISKCON, and there's obvious reasons for that.
Could you explain those reasons for us?
First, Rittvik is heresy. Many of the air quotes ISKCON leaders do not want to be tainted by approving, even minimally, what the vast majority of Vedic and Vaishnava leaders and followers throughout India consider to be an unauthorized movement promulgated by a heretical belief in mass initiations advertised as linking people to a non-manifest guru. Secondly, the GBC has, on and for the record, formally condemned Rittvik as quote-unquote a dangerous deviation in its 1990 annual resolution. To walk that back would be more than just an embarrassment. It would be rightly seen as a compromise. So-called ISKCON cannot afford too many more of those, since it has made many of them already. Third, there is profound animosity between and amongst many prominent leaders of so-called ISKCON and the prominent leaders of Rittvik. They do not have friendly feelings. This contempt, and in some cases hatred, is not expressed openly, but it's known by many. It is tangible and cannot easily be assuaged, if it even ever could be.
But wasn't this the goal of the ISKCON reform movement, to reform ISKCON and have the two sides, in effect, merge?
Originally it was. Just like before that even, the original Rittvik proposal by the 4 Brahmins of Mississippi was to have the GBC become an integral part of how Rittvik was to be conducted. It proposed this by giving the Commish sole power to appoint Ritviks. That had to be abandoned. In due course, the leaders and members of IRM realized that so-called ISKCON could not be reformed. As such, they changed the interpretation of their acronym to mean the ISKCON Revival Movement, or, as it is known by many of them, Greater ISKCON. Tatvamasi.
What is the idea behind this moniker, Greater ISKCON?
It means that ISKCON is not limited to the GBC, but is instead comprised of all loyal devotees to the movement. Read Rittvik. It means the real devotees of Prabhupada, and they also call themselves by the concocted term of Prabhupada-anugas, that the real devotees of Prabhupada, particularly those Prabhupada-initiated disciples from 1966 to 67, that they now carry the truth. Greater ISKCON is supposedly the real movement. Obviously, the term refers to the Rittvik movement as the keeper of the flame, or you could analogously say as the first church of Prabhupada the Redeemer.
As it was reproduced in Chapter 15, what is your opinion of the 1990 GBC resolution against the Ritviks, which reads as follows? Whereas the posthumous Rittvik theory, a concocted system by which a spiritual master allegedly acts as Diksha Guru after his departure through the agency of Ritviks, or officiating priests, has never been sanctioned by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Whereas posthumous Rittvik initiation has never been practiced by the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya, disciplic succession. Whereas posthumous Rittvik initiation has never been approved by sadhu, śāstra, and guru. Whereas the posthumous Rittvik theory essentially conflicts with the law of disciplic succession as established by Lord Sri Krishna, as taught by Śrīla Prabhupāda and all previous acharyas, and as practiced by all bona fide Vaishnava Sampradayas. The GBC hereby declares that the posthumous Rittvik initiation theory is a dangerous philosophical deviation. It is therefore totally prohibited in ISKCON. No devotee shall participate in such a posthumous Rittvik initiation ceremony in any capacity, including acting as Rittvik, initiate, assistant, organizer, or financier. No ISKCON devotee shall advocate or support its practice.
I agree with these resolutions, but the criticisms mentioned are not only applicable to air quotes ISKCON people. I do not approve of that term posthumous Rittvik, however. There's an inference in it which is offensive. The resolution should have stuck with the Rittvik-in-absentia, which so-called ISKCON occasionally employs. In terms of the final part of the resolution, there's no enforcement mechanism mentioned. One could have been listed, but it's not specified, and that's a weakness of the resolution. However, although lacking de jure explicitness, de facto there was an enforcement mechanism. 3 of the 4 Mississippi Brahmins who inaugurated that initial scheme were excommunicated. One of them, a bit later, repented, abandoned Rittvik, and returned to so-called ISKCON.
Did Prabhupada ever explicitly state that a disciple has to accept a guru who is physically manifest? Or did he ever use the term living guru?
Affirmative. We have already shown that he used the term quote-unquote physical spiritual master as the necessary complement to Paramatma in that room conversation with the Irish poet O'Grady in the spring of 1974. There is also this concise statement by Prabhupada from a platform lecture on November 20th, 1975, quote, "One has to take lessons from a live Bhagavat," unquote.
The Ritviks consider it offensive to call Prabhupada a living guru while he was physically manifest, because he never underwent death like an ordinary conditioned soul. He is still living now as a mukta jiva, and they harp on this supposed offense.
It is simply another example of their fanaticism. The use of the term living guru differentiates the Prabhupada we knew and saw while he had a spiritually infused physical body and what he is now, which is without that physical form. There is no offense in the term, but the Ritviks are prone to grasp any straw they can in order to support their heresy.
You are quoted only a few times in chapter 15, and, as could be expected, your quotes are all powerful criticisms of the Rittvik concoction. 2 of those are brief, but one is quite lengthy. Would you be willing to read that one for our edification and realization?
Sure. We shall start with Doktorski's introduction to my long quote. Quote, a Gaudiya Vaishnavacharya can change the sadhana, but he cannot change the siddhanta. He cannot say that Shiva, not Krishna, is the Supreme Lord, and he cannot say that after his departure from this world he can still initiate new disciples by Rittvik proxy. Kailāsa Candra, a Rittvik critic, presented his assessment of the Rittvik-in-absentia system. Quote, the promoters of Rittvik have not given their disciples a connection with Prabhupada. All that has been given are colorful nuggets of glass, which they claim are diamonds. No one has actually benefited. Time will prove this. Where and when did Prabhupada definitively establish a Rittvik-in-absentia theory? Rittvik is automatically terminated in relation to a spiritual master when the spiritual master is no longer physically manifest. This has been the system in all 4 sampradayas since they have functioned on this planet. Only one Sahajiya group, the Kartabhajas, attempted something similar to Rittvik, but the standard and established sampradayas never have done so. In fact, this is so standard and automatically understood that it is not set down anywhere that I know of, because there's no need for it to be set down anywhere. However, if Rittvik, as practiced today in different ways by many splinter groups, was to be a brand new system, a brand new innovation in his branch of the Sampradaya, then Prabhupada would have had to have specifically stated such to be the case. And if he did so, he did not, then he would have been obligated to provide details as to how it was to be carried out. Since he never did any of this, there are all kinds of differing Ritviks with different conceptions and different processes throughout the world. Indirectly, this in and of itself gives conclusive evidence that Rittvik-in-absentia is a concoction. No guru, including the Acharya, Uttamadhikari, can meddle with either the tattva or the siddhanta. The siddhanta is derived from the tattva and is in that sense non-different from it. The general processes are included in both the tattva and the siddhanta, although they are mostly in the siddhanta. The Vedanta Sutra is an example of siddhanta. Some specific processes can be adjusted. Prabhupada did that in a number of ways. My terminology here would be that these are downline sadhanas, which, when adjusted by the Acharya, I'm very skeptical that a Madhyamadikari can make these adjustments. When adjusted by the Acharya, they're adjusted in order to facilitate Krishna consciousness. The Acharyas do not meddle at all with the tattva or the siddhanta. Most definitely, Rittvik defies the siddhanta big time. Prabhupada did not have the authority to change the law of disciplic succession. He did not do so. But for those who believe that he did have the authority and power to create anything like the Rittvik-in-absentia theory, They are absolute fools. They have no understanding whatsoever of the genuine Guru, even when he is an Uttamadhikari Sampradaya Acharya, which Prabhupada was, of course. The Guru cannot say that Lord Shiva is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and there are many other tattvas, siddhantas, spiritual and devotional laws that he cannot modify in any way, what to speak of radically changing. The Rittvik system of proxy, diksha, initiations worked well when it was authorized. It was authorized during the physical manifestation of His Divine Grace, Śrīla A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupāda. On November 14th, 1977, the Rittvik system, if you can call it that, although such terminology comports a subtle misconception, the Rittvik system was no longer valid. It became defunct. Any remnant of it still active went into the category of Upasiddhanta. All the Rittvik concoctions completely lack a sound Shastric basis. Indeed, they really have none at all. But due to the deviations of the party men over so many decades, almost nobody has faith anymore in the air quotes ISKCON process, philosophy, or initiation system. That is why Rittvik, which is ultimately in the mode of ignorance, works like a rock to break the scissors of the air quotes ISKCON Weltanschauung. Some Ritviks even spoil the ISKCON Jagannath Rath cart parades each summer by making very noticeable propaganda against the cult during the festivities themselves. This has not gone unnoticed by the Western press. Unquote.
At the conclusion of Chapter 15, Doktorski quotes a current and influential ISKCON leader who attempts to sum up the Rittvik deviation by saying that it is, at root, similar to other inimical ISKCON splinter groups, namely Neomut, which you exposed threadbare last month. I would like to read this section and then imbibe, for the benefit of the readers and listeners of this podcast, your analysis of it. To conclude this chapter, let's examine the similarities between the Neo-Gaudiya Mutt and the Ritviks, as noted by Dhruta Das in his 69-page essay, Śrīla Prabhupāda and the Gaudiya Mutt. Dhruta explains, at the root of every ISKCON heresy lies the Mutt mentality. The current Rittvik movement wants a Gaudiya Mutt regime, the single guru model, except that the single guru does not change. It remains Prabhupada for all time. The ISKCON members who have deserted ISKCON for various Gaudiya Mutt gurus are also adhering to this Mutt system. They could not accept their guru's decision that they go through the admittedly difficult process of submitting to a collective management system in ISKCON. They want to take shelter of some single acharya figure outside ISKCON, or they want to bring that acharya into ISKCON and replace the collective management system that Prabhupada set up with their own favorite Gaudiya Mutt guru. Dhruta claims that both the Neo-Gaudiya Mutt devotees and the Rittvik devotees are essentially the same. Both were unable to work within the collective system which Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupāda had attempted to set up, even if the collective system was mauled by the dysfunctional GBC. And so they joined or created a single acharya system which seems simpler, but actually appears to be against the expressed desires of both Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Prabhupada and his foremost disciple, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, who desired a collective guru system.
Oh yeah. This is nothing but a shrewd diversionary tactic. It is claiming that the chief deviation of these two splinter groups is the sole acharya myth, and this idea was first propounded by Ravindra in the mid-80s. As such, it both directly and indirectly glorifies so-called ISKCON, alleging that after the gold rush of the heady zonal acharya era, the institution returned to its bona fides by establishing its current quote-unquote collective system. The collegiate compromise of the Second Transformation was nothing more than another deviation replacing the zonal scam. Aside from that fact, Neomut and Rittvik do not have a sole acharya idea in common. Rittvik sports an unauthorized sole acharya model, but Neomut has many so-called acharyas who sometimes work together when it pleases them to do so, and who also conclave once per year in Mayapur and Mathura. What they have in common is that Swami B.R. Sridhar directly influenced the manifestation of Neomut and subtly influenced the manifestation of Rittvik. Since we've reached the end of our analysis of Chapter 15, let me now share an excerpt I offered and still offer all of you in my most recent book entitled On Consciousness and the Perfection of Man. Quote, Prabhupada wanted Monitor gurus, but he did not name any. He wanted Madhyam Adhikari gurus, but he did not name any. He wanted regular gurus. He did not officially recognize any regular gurus because there were none to recognize. In other words, by not specifically naming or recognizing or appointing any of his disciples as Diksha gurus, he did not make a specific and immediate appointment or appointments for continuation of initiations in his movement. He did, however, through extensive writing and preaching on the subject, make comprehensive and adequate arrangements for continuing guru-disciple initiations. However, that's as far as he could go. There is no injunction that a founder must either name a successor or, less than that, name a regular guru or gurus, if any, or when there are none to be so recognized. If he does not see any, he does not name any. While still with us, he appointed 11 Ritviks to initiate on his behalf, and that's all. That he named Ritviks, which is nothing new, is which has primed the centrifugal Rittvik concoction to come up with its illegitimate projection for continuing initiations after Prabhupada departed. Both so-called ISKCON and its inimical splinter group, the Ritviks, believe that there must have been a specific, foolproof, guaranteed arrangement provided by Prabhupada for immediate initiations after he departed. There was not. They both believe that his movement had to go on and that he made a guaranteed arrangement that it would. It does not, and he didn't. Spiritual lines or branches are always subject to disappearing. As we have mentioned previously, from this verse of Bhagavad Gita, chapter 4, text 2, Evang paramparā praptam, imang rajarshayo vidhu, sa kale neha mahata yogo nashtaha parantapa. O subduer of the enemy, this yoga system was thus received and understood by saintly kings through Guru Paramparā. In due course of time, that great knowledge of yoga here in this world was scattered and lost. Lord Krishna himself had to reestablish a line of Guru Paramparā that had been lost, and he did this through Arjuna over 5,000 years ago. Lines were still being scattered at that time. In those days, people, including gurus and disciples, were very elevated in culture, strength, intelligence, duration of life, knowledge, and behavior. What to speak of now? Prabhupada's branch of the Hare Krishna movement could never be guaranteed to continue unless an Uttama Adhikari emerged from it as his best disciple. If one had emerged, his divine grace would have recognized him. That man would have been the successor. However, no such disciple emerged, although 11 pretenders to that status did manifest for some time as part of the scattering process. The line could still be carried out, genuine initiation from genuine gurus, if some madhyams had emerged, but that also did not transpire. You may consider this statement controversial, but that would be nothing but the emblem of your ignorance. The colossal hoax, known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, is a pseudo-spiritual scam. Once it instituted the zonal takeover, which was a smash-and-grab affair, hijacking and killing the real movement, it set the stage for all kinds of concoctions. Neo-Mutt came first, and it is horrible, of course. Pandora's box was then opened even wider, and in late 1989, out popped the Rittvik heresy. Sadeva Samya,